So over next 20 to 25 minutes, I'll be talking about the non-invasive assessment of NASH, otherwise non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So what is the definition of non-alcoholic fatty liver? So by definition, it is very clear cut. That is accumulation of fat in more than 5% of the liver in the absence of significant alcohol intake. That is part of the definition itself. And we know what is significant alcohol intake. And NAFLD is a spectrum of diseases, and in that we have what we call as the non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. We initially had a confusion whether we need to call this as this meeting as MAFLD, which is a new term proposed as metabolic syndrome associated fatty liver disease. But then we stuck to the old term because the basic underlying disease is the same, the concepts are the same, and we are going to talk about the NASH or non-alcoholic fatty steatohepatitis. So why this fatty liver is very important? It's just because the sheer number of people who have the fatty liver. So if you see in Asia, around about 1/4 of people have fatty liver, and if you take in specific groups of people like diabetes, the presence of fatty liver may go up to 40 or 50%. So roughly about 1/3 or 1/4 of the world's population has fatty liver, and this number may increase if we do not curtail the eating and change our lifestyle. So the NAFLD or the NASH has become one of the most common causes of the end-stage liver disease, next or almost same as alcohol. So earlier we had lots of patients coming with hepatitis B or C, and now we have got very good drugs with hepatitis C, so that has come down. Hepatitis B with universal vaccination and also very good drugs. So incidence of end-stage liver disease with those two viruses will come down. So we are going to have predominantly either alcoholic liver disease or a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which will be the main reason for people going for liver transplant. So the natural history of liver disease, so that's a spectrum. So the fatty liver may be a benign disease, and in that, for some people, they may go on to have steatohepatitis, or some people may go on for cirrhosis, and some may have HCC, that is hepatocellular carcinoma, over different periods of time. So we need to know at what spectrum we are seeing our patients. So for this whole talk, when we talk about certain terms, we need to be familiar. So it is the same metabolic scoring of the staging. So when we say no fibrosis or mild fibrosis, it will be F0, F1. Significant fibrosis, that means F2 or more. Advanced fibrosis means F3 or more. Cirrhosis is F4. So why is knowing the non-invasive assessment becomes very important? So certain concepts in NAFLD. So what is here is that it is not just the presence of steatohepatitis. So steatohepatitis means there is inflammation, which is what leads to the fibrosis. But then the presence of steatohepatitis does not predict mortality or development of liver complications. It is the presence of fibrosis stage which predicts the development of the complications. So if this is a very good study published in 2017 about more than 600 biopsy proven NAFLD, what they have seen that the time taken for somebody with an F0, F1, that patient to develop a decompensation, that's more than 20 to 25 years. Whereas if it is F2, it is around 9.3 years. So it is going to be taking another 10 to 20 years for him to develop a decompensation. So we need to know this. Timeline to understand and to diagnose people early. This is also from the same study. Here it talks about what is the incidence of the mortality. So if you have F2, F3 or F4, that means that they are more likely to die. That means about 1.6 times if you have F2, it is 3 times if you have F3, and it is 6 times if you have cirrhosis or F4. Another important concept, this is more recently published paper last year. So there is something called as 20% rule of progression in F3, F4 NASH. So the biopsy proven bridging, if they have biopsy proven NASH, so about 20% of people can progress over 2 years to cirrhosis. If they start with cirrhosis, 20% of them may progress to hepatic decompensation over 2 years. And there are predictors. So we will look at that. That is what we are trying to look in this talk. So the key issues in NAFLD is differentiating steatohepatitis from simple fatty liver and the identification of advanced fibrosis. So most of the talk will be on advanced fibrosis, but we will touch on this also. So we know, so NASH means the gold standard is liver biopsy. Still, irrespective of all the advancements in other blood tests or the imaging, liver biopsy remains the standard. But there are various limitations with it, which we all know. That means it is invasive because of the invasiveness, the patient acceptance, some morbidity, the cost, and more importantly, now it is known that there is a sampling error and also the interpretation. So, you know, F2 or F3 the interpretation may vary between different pathologies. So it has its own limitations. And you know, you cannot keep on repeating this liver biopsy every year or every few years. So we need to have a much more simpler assessment of the steatohepatitis and fibrosis. So non-invasive testing of NASH, we can divide it into 3 headings. One is this, how to diagnose and grade steatosis, diagnosis of steatohepatitis, and the staging of fibrosis. So steatosis. So initial diagnostic method will be ultrasound abdomen. The main limitation will be that steatosis less than 20% may be difficult to identify with the ultrasound abdomen. The second one is the CT attenuation index. So this is what we use for assessment in liver donors to see how much fat they have, but it may not be possible in a general population, in diabetic screening or people who walk into master health checkup. It may not be possible to do CT to just, assess the amount of fat. So in CT attenuation index, the normal liver attenuation is 50 to 65 Hounsfield units. And it is about 8 to 10 units higher than that of spleen. So when the liver values are much lower, so that means less than 45 or 40, or if it is in the negative, the liver attenuation index is in negative, that means that liver has significant fat. And then we have what we called as the attenuation parameter, which is available with FibroScan, where it looks at the ultrasound attenuation of the hepatic fat. So this is still not very standardized, but most studies have quoted, more than 275 decibels per meter with a sensitivity of 90% to detect steatosis. But the most accurate one as of now is the MRI-derived proton density fat fraction. So they use some signal intensity differences in the MRI, and they tell how much of fat is there in the hepatocytes. So this is superior to all the other modalities. So as I said before, for assessment in a liver donor, we use the CT attenuation index as well as the MRI PDFF to assess the amount of fat. The second component of NASH, that is the steatohepatitis. So steatohepatitis is defined by biopsy as steatosis, ballooning, and inflammation with or without fibrosis. So unfortunately, we do not have any good marker to detect steatohepatitis except the liver biopsy. So lots of studies has been done with cytokines. So basically, it is an intermediate filament protein, and it is cleaved during the period of cell death. So when this has been studied for assessing steatohepatitis, and this is the area under receiver operating curve, so which tells about the accuracy of a test, it is about 0.8. So we know that 1 is perfect, so we don't have any test which has a perfect score. So this is around 0.8. If you can add some more markers to this, so like, if the presence of metabolic syndrome plus an ALT level and then CK18, the accuracy improves a little bit more. If you add adiponectin, so the accuracy increases a little bit more. But these tests we are not routinely using clinically to assess the steatohepatitis. So coming to the most important topic, as I said before, assessment of fibrosis, because we want to know what stage the patient is, so because we want to prognosticate the disease. So there are serum markers and there are elastography. So serum markers may be indirect or direct. So indirect markers means they look at the alterations in the liver function test, which may point towards the fibrosis. So there are lots of scores which have been studied, but I'm just mentioning about the two common ones which are, used. So one is the NAFLD fibrosis score. So these calculators are available online. So NAFLD fibrosis scores uses age, BMI, presence of diabetes, AST-ALT ratio, platelets, and albumin. And there is the FIB4. This is also very commonly used. So which just looks at the age, platelet count, AST, and ALT. So if there are any diabetologists or physicians who are watching this, so all the patients would have these parameters as part of their routine master health checkup. So with this itself, we can, if somebody has a fatty liver, we can calculate this in our office and then find out whether, whether the patient has significant fibrosis or not. So generally, when you say FIB4, values less than 1.3 will rule out significant fibrosis. So one point to remember about this non-invasive, test is that, so there are two ends of the spectrum. One is to rule out advanced fibrosis, another is to rule in advanced fibrosis. So there will be a significant number of people in the mid, the gray zone. So for which we will need subsequent testing. So the gray zone areas may be somewhere around 30% may fall in the gray zone. So then we need to go for the second testing. So the direct serum markers of fibrosis. So in this, they look at the, the fibrosis. We know there is going to be like extracellular matrix turnover is there. So this reflects the extracellular matrix turnover. So some products are, evaluated in that. So they look at the type 3 collagen, the precursor C3 protein, hyaluronic acids, or metalloproteinase inhibitors. So all these products are seen, and there are 2 or 3 patented serum biomarkers. That means, so this is patented by a company. So like this enhanced liver fibrosis is done by Siemens. So they hold the, the calculator, everything. So we send the blood for testing and they will give you the values. So this is something I have used for some patients. And here, the receiver operating curve is 0.83 for detecting advanced fibrosis. So this is also available commercially in India. So now coming to the elastography. So elastography, basically what it means is that, you send an, ultrasound impulse through the liver, and the way it passes through the liver, you measure it, and then it looks at the stiffness of the liver. So that is what we're trying to find out by the elastography. So there are 2-3 methods. The transient elastography is the most commonly used one. There is also the RFE, and that you have the 2D shear wave elastography also. So the transient, and then you have the MR elastography. The transient elastography is freely available, and this is something which can be done by hepatologists or even by a well-trained technician. So a low frequency wave propagates through the liver. It is done through the right intercostal spaces, and when that wave is passing through the liver, if the liver is stiff, that means the velocity will be the wave will be propagated in a very fast way. So there are some parameters to say that a transient elastography is done properly. So you need to have 10 successful values, and the success rate should be more than 60%, and the IQR, interquartile range. That means the variation from the median value should be less than 30%. So these results are expressed in kilopascals, that is kPa, and it can range anywhere from 2 to 75, and the normal value is 5. So this is much better than the previously what I told, the blood test. It's around 0.85 to 0.94. And this elastography, so I told you, it will tell us about the stage of the fibrosis. That means whether the patient is in F1, F2, F3, F4. It is a spectrum. It is a spectrum. So at least we may not be able to tell the exact stage, but it is good to rule out and rule in fibrosis. And not just the stage of fibrosis. It goes beyond that. So I have been interested in this transient elastography for past 4 or 5 years, because I want to predict, development of cirrhosis many years earlier, like 10 to 15 years earlier itself. We can say, okay, this patient is going to go for, cirrhosis. But I was not using this for patients with established cirrhosis. So like somebody with a compensated cirrhosis, we know the nodular liver is there, the platelets are like 120. So we know the patient has cirrhosis. So is there any role for elastography after that? Yes. So this elastography can also be used for prediction of complications. So suppose, so they have, looked at the number of people who develop decompensation. So if so people who have values more than 40 kilopascals, so they are more likely to develop decompensation. It is something, of degree like 29 versus 8%. So you can predict the decompensation, even patients with established cirrhosis. So like if you're going to do it serially, so I do it now, it is 21. So patient obviously has cirrhosis. And after 2 years, I do it is, like 35, and then it goes to 45. That means he's more likely to decompensate. One is that. The second, it has also been studied in patients with HCC who undergo hepatectomy. So if they have, what they've seen is they have stiffness of more than 15.7, they are more likely to have post-operative liver failure. And then, it can predict large varices and small varices. So more than 45 versus in those with small varices is only around 26. It can also predict bleeders versus non-bleeders. Bleeders have around 50 or 52 kilopascals, whereas non-bleeders, it is around 30 to 35. So we can predict the complications also in this. So there are some challenges with this elastography. So we know that, there is an impulse which is going to pass through the liver. So obviously, so with that, we can make out that somebody who has thick abdominal wall, so either because they're obese, they're overweight, or if there is some fluid here, that means they are going to have some ascites. No, we are not going to get the right values. So those patients, we need the results may be unreliable. Another thing is we need to know when this elastography may overestimate the values. So overestimation, that means the liver appears more stiff. So obviously that means when patients has got acute hepatitis, that means very high ALT values, extra hepatic cholestasis, that means there is a biliary obstruction, there is a congestive heart failure, there is an outflow obstruction. So all these things will increase the values, and recent food intake. So up to 2, if it is done within 2 or 3 hours, that means there is increased blood flow to the portal, through the portal system. So that can also increase the values. We need to remember all these, challenges. The point shear wave elastography, it is part of a routine ultrasound. So the radiologist will see the liver, and then they will determine a point about 2 to 3 centimeters below the capsule, and almost similar mechanism, and they will assess the values. Okay, so here it is, it is meter per second. I don't know whether you can see here. Okay, so these values, like anything more than 1.5 or 1.6 is generally they have significant fibrosis, and usually more than 1.8 may indicate cirrhosis. The next one will be the 2D shear wave. So here you can see that it is 2D. The radiologists can choose the region of interest. They can avoid big, the blood vessels, and they can do it. The latest one is the MR elastography, which is probably the most accurate one. So here, this one, it is not freely available. I don't think so it is available in South India as of now. And the optimal cutoffs for these, the numbers are a bit different. So the numbers will be like, for F3, 4.1 and more than 4.7 generally indicates cirrhosis. So I'm coming towards the end. So there now recently, EASL has published guidelines. It's very recent, in the last 1 month. So they have published the non-invasive tests, the guidelines of how it can be used to assess the severity and prognosis. So I'm just telling you about some points which are given in that update. So one is, first question they have asked is, how accurate are these non-invasive tests to diagnose steatosis? So they have mentioned about the CAP, but, as of now, it is not still recommended as a first line technique, because it is still not very, there's no guidelines as on what values are correct, but generally accepted values are that more than 275 may indicate steatosis. And other blood tests are not useful. Conventional ultrasound is the first line to identify steatosis, and most accurate is the MRI-PDFF, just like how we saw now. So this term has also been introduced by EASL. So what we call as compensated advanced chronic liver disease. That means they are at risk for the developing clinically significant portal hypertension. So the fibrosis and cirrhosis is a spectrum, and we cannot always distinguish this only by our clinical acumen. So as per the Baveno 6 consensus, so LSM more than 10 is suggestive of compensated advanced chronic liver disease, and more than 15 is highly suggestive. So this is as per the guidelines. And this has also mentioned about the varices. So how accurate are these tests in diagnosing and excluding high risk varices? So what is validated already is that LSM less than 20 and platelets more than 150. It is a validated tool to rule out high risk varices, and we can avoid endoscopic screening in these patients. So that is, if you have a transient elastography in your region, so you can definitely use that to rule out high risk varices. And how accurate are these tests in prediction of clinical decompensation, HCC, or mortality? So there is a strong recommendation that liver stiffness should be used at diagnosis in addition to the liver function test to stratify the risk of decompensation. And what it has suggested is that you can repeat the measurements annually, to redefine the risk. So the conclusions. So all these non-invasive tests, it detects the presence of significant fibrosis, and not just that, it also detects the risk of developing adverse events. It is not a one-time study. We have to repeat it at a periodic interval to monitor the changes in fibrosis over time. And sequential testing may give more accurate results. The cutoffs which are generally accepted for these tests, for LSM, that is liver stiffness measurement, generally less than 8 will rule out advanced fibrosis. For ELF, that is enhanced liver fibrosis test, which is a blood test, less than 9.8 usually rules out advanced fibrosis. For FIB4, it will be less than 1.3. For NAFLD fibrosis care, it will be less than minus 1.455. So this is the algorithm which is suggested by the EASL now. So if you see a patient, especially in the primary care or gastro clinic, a patient at risk for chronic liver disease, so they have mentioned about all the risk factors, and if you're seeing that they are mainly metabolic risk factors or alcohol, you calculate the FIB4, and if the FIB4 is less than 1.3, then there is no need for referral. You can restate again in 1 to 3 years. If the FIB4 is more than 1.3, okay, then you go for the liver stiffness by the transient elastography, and then you see. So suppose if it is more than 8, that means there is a risk of advanced fibrosis. So they have suggested if you have the other serum test like ELF, you can do that. And if both are correlating, so like if I see a patient with liver stiffness of 13 or 14, and I have an ELF which says 11, that means both are correlating. So that means it's highly likely that they have advanced fibrosis. But if they are not correlating, so one values are different, one is low, another is high, then we may consider liver biopsy. So basically what all these algorithms say is that we don't go by one particular test. We may have to go for sequential testing or multiple testing to predict advanced fibrosis. And repeat testings. So as of now, there is no definite full evidence, but what is recommended is that if it is an early stage, then you can do it after 3 years. But if it is advanced stage, you can repeat every year. So I come to the end. Thank you for being there. So it says with no history of blood transfusion, thalassemia minor alone. So thalassemia minor, so the child is likely to have fatty liver. Child is likely to have fatty liver, and so enzymes are elevated. So we as usual we rule out all the other liver diseases which can be possible in a young child, 11 years, with elevated transaminases. That means we rule out viral diseases, we rule out, Wilson's, all the other diseases we need to rule out. And then, yes, we can do a transient elastography, but if we don't come to a conclusion, we may need a liver biopsy. There is one more question here. Can you halt the progression of elastography score, say 30 kPa, above 40 kPa in NASH, apart from weight loss? Can you halt the progression? Okay. So the question is that can you halt the progression of elastography scores? So basically the question says that can you halt the progression of fibrosis? That is the $1 million industry. Okay. So can you halt the progression of fibrosis? So weight loss is the only proven intervention as of now. But there are lots of studies, randomized controlled trials which are going on, and most of them as of now is in F3 or F2, so like obeticholic acid. So they have shown 25% reduction in one stage of fibrosis. That is where we are as of now. And when to consider a liver biopsy in a NASH patient? So when to consider liver biopsy in a NASH patient? So as I told you, one is, whenever there is a doubt, whenever there is a doubt in a diagnosis, that means you think there is an additional component of, if the patient is has a diabetic fatty liver with hepatitis B. So you do not know whether this transaminases is from the NASH component or from the hepatitis B component. So if there is a conflicting etiologies, we can do. And as part as part of all study interventions, biopsy is a must to document, regression in fibrosis. Third, as I told you, sometimes there may be a discordance between the tests. So one test may show higher values, another test may not be showing higher values. So when there is a discordance, if you want to be sure, we need to do a liver biopsy. Okay. So we have the next speaker here, Dr. Sunil Shelvi. He's a senior consultant transplant surgeon in Bangalore, and he's here to talk about liver transplantation. So I encourage all our attendees to continue putting their questions, and we will answer it towards the end after Sunil Shelvi finishes. Over to you, Sunil.
Yeah, I hope everybody can hear me now.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, sorry, I joined a little late. I was stuck with a sick patient. And then at the outset, I want to thank Team FibroTouch, Lee and Mr. Budlesh Patil for arranging this wonderful session and getting us together here. Wonderful lecture by Dr. Hema Mala. Even I had so many doubts, the medical issues, so many were clarified. And then I want to thank all the attendees. Most of them are my friends, colleagues. There are some of my teachers also. I think it's a very hot topic, so everybody is interested. A couple of years back, when I was a resident, anybody came with the fatty liver ultrasound report, we never used to care for it. But now I think it has emerged as very important disease, and all of us have to make sure that we treat fatty liver patients. And Himala madam kind of elaborated why, how, and all those things. I'm going to talk about NASH and liver transplantation. So I'm working in BGS Clinical Global Hospital as a transplant surgeon. So this was a transplant we did in February of this year. And then it was a 12-hour surgery, and 38-year-old male who was weighing around 160 kilos. And the etiology for liver failure was NASH cirrhosis. And then we had a tough time, but patient did well, and he flew back. Operating in a patient who is 160 kilos was very challenging. We had to arrange a big operation table for him, and then so many post-op issues. The CT scan had to be compatible to his weight. The anesthetists had to be on their toes, and our dietitians, physiotherapists, all played a significant role for helping this patient to recover from transplantation. So this is what we are looking at nowadays. So Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease account for nearly 75% of chronic liver disease in US. In India, our data is very poor, and NAFLD exists in two main histological subtypes. One is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And this is characterized by 5% fat on histopathology. And how will you differentiate the NFL from NASH? So whenever on histopathology you have ballooning, lobular inflammation or steatosis. So all three together, you label them as NASH. And NASH is something we have to worry about. It doesn't mean that we should not worry about NFL, like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but NASH is something more important than NFLD. But we don't know like who will get into NASH, so we all have to make sure that our liver is free from fat. So this is a typical histopathology, and then we grade it depending on the percentage of hepatocyte who have fat, like grade 1 5 to 25%, grade 2 26 to 50%, grade 3 is 51 to 75%, and grade 4 is more than 75%. So this is also important in cadaveric liver. So whenever I go to harvest liver and I feel it is fatty, then sometimes we take a biopsy and see for fat in those livers. So sometimes you can see Mallory bodies, and in advanced diseases you will find fibrosis. Dr. Himala has covered all these things in detail. But why so much noise about NASH? Because patients who have NASH, they have risk of worsening, like they can end up getting end-stage liver disease. And the other important thing is that they may end up getting hepatocellular carcinoma. 20% of the patients who have NASH will develop cirrhosis. So this is very important. So other thing is, if you have NASH, then the risk of getting a HCC is 7.7%. This is based on the data from 2002 to 2016. So if you have NASH, then you have 7.7 fold increase in the risk of HCC. So this is why we have to worry about NASH. This is why we have to worry about fatty liver. So the FibroTouch, wonderful machine, and then it's very good at telling you how much is the steatosis and how much is the fibrosis. And there are very good studies out there which can vouch for this machine. And it has been also been helpful in patients with chronic hepatitis B to assess the fibrosis. So the FibroTouch is a good machine for telling you how much fibrosis or steatosis you have in liver. So these are the anthropometric measures which will tell you about liver steatosis based on FibroTouch machine. So coming to the epidemiology and natural history of NAFLD or NASH. So the issues before liver transplantation. So there is ELTR or UNOS data, and the data has shown that NASH or NFLD has been a fastest growing indication for LT in last 20 years. And they are also a fastest growing cause of HCC in both Europe and United States. And then the incidence of NASH related HCC is estimated to increase by 137% from 2015 to 2030. So why I'm quoting this ELTR, like European data and US data, because we don't have a very robust database. But in India, like whenever we don't find the cause like Hep B, Hep C, or alcohol, then we used to label them as cryptogenic cirrhosis. And now we know most of those cryptogenic cirrhosis were indeed having NASH cirrhosis. So that is something we all have to understand. Like I'm pretty sure all of us, when we were residents or medical students, is told that 50% of the cases are cryptogenic cirrhosis because they don't have hepatitis B, C, or alcohol history. So NASH. So most of those cryptogenic cirrhosis were basically because of NASH. So patients who have NASH will have diabetes mellitus. They may have obesity. They may have cardiovascular disease. So this is all we have to understand. And now there is some discussion about changing this disease from NASH to MASH. Like metabolic dysfunction associated steatohepatitis. So there is some debate going on. Should we call it as MASH, metabolic dysfunction associated, because it happens in presence of diabetes mellitus, obesity, and cardiovascular diseases. And there are some subset of patients who we call as lean NASH. They are not obese, but they may be undernourished and they can have NASH because of undernutrition. So, and whenever we are seeing NASH patients with cirrhosis, we have to optimize these conditions: diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. So coming to a patient with NASH cirrhosis comes to me for transplant listing, what I'm going to look at for diabetes mellitus, oral glucose tolerance test is the gold standard, and we look at HbA1c for all the patients. We should have a good glycemic control in this patient, and we have to assess the severity of liver disease whenever patient has diabetes and NASH cirrhosis. Second thing we do before transplant is assess the nutrient status of the patient. The patient is obese, we help them to lose weight. We have to tell them about healthy diet. I'm going to talk more about healthy diet. We have to tell them about the physical exercise to avoid malnutrition and sarcopenia. A lot of studies going on about sarcopenia. I have published myself one study on the effect of sarcopenia on patient survival, and I'm the first one to show that sarcopenia can in fact affect the graft survival also. So this was published last year in HPB, and then and if patient needed like early liver cirrhotic patient, we can do some pharmacological intervention or bariatric surgery. Cardiovascular point of view, we have to do a risk stratification, and then I'm going to talk about the workup we do in these patients. Patient can have kidney dysfunction, so we have to optimize them. And then if they have kind of CKD, then we have to see whether the patient needs combined liver and kidney transplantation. The patients with NASH are at increased risk of malignancies, especially GI malignancies, stomach and colon, and HCC, of course. So we have to make sure that we have screened them for that, and we have to keep a watch on this. So this is a broad outline. Whenever a NASH cirrhosis patient comes to me, and these are the things which I look for. And then patients after transplant, they are at a high risk of peri-surgical complications like infection. And then after transplant, the patient have high risk of malignancy and cardiovascular events. So the recent American study has shown that the recipients who got liver transplant for NASH or NAFLD, they have a lower survival compared to the patient who got transplanted for HCC, HCV, or alcohol-related liver diseases. And the cause for lower survival is the cardiovascular and cerebrovascular disease. So a patient gets transplant for NASH cirrhosis, you don't just forget about them. You have to keep a watch on their cardiovascular health and their neurological status immediately after transplant and in the long term also. So other thing we need to before that, the Indian experience, there is some data about Indian experience in these patients. So after transplant, the NAFLD or NASH is common, and we have to remember, just doing a transplant, you are not curing them from the disease. Actually, NASH is a lifestyle disease or a metabolic dysfunction. By doing a liver transplant, you are only reversing the liver problem, but the metabolic problems will continue for sure, and then they may have recurrence of NAFLD and NASH in the new liver, and then this new liver is more susceptible for steatosis and other complications like cirrhosis. So you have to be more watchful. And then almost 50% prevalence of metabolic syndrome after liver transplant. So this is what we need to remember, and this data is from Indian setup. So, so after liver transplant, in patients with HCC who which was secondary to NASH or NAFLD. So the overall survival and graft survival are similar to patients who got transplant CLD for non-NASH causes, but the tumor recurrence is also similar. But we all have to remember that they are at a high risk of cardiovascular or cerebrovascular diseases. So This is a typical male, but this I have taken from a US literature. So in US, like when I was getting trained, all these patients who are obese and having NASH, we used to give them, encourage them to take Mediterranean diet, low calorie diet, which with good amount of protein, and then uh, these were like these are the things we used to tell them. But in Indian setup, we cannot like patients are not very much in favor of Mediterranean diet. So we have a good dietary team, the nutritional specialist, and they go through the history and then they do a new detailed nutritional assessment and they give the diet. So what generally important for these patients is a low calorie diet, and then we like coffee is known to protect your liver. So plenty of coffee, and then olive oil. People advise olive oil. So all these things, like we have to focus on their diet before transplant and after transplant. So this is the cardiac evaluation in patients who have NASH. So whenever a patient with NASH cirrhosis comes to us, as I told you, that they may have underlying a silent cardiac disease. So both, like you have to evaluate them, like both from the right heart problem and left heart problem. So there are patients who have hepatopulmonary syndrome or portopulmonary hypertension. So we get a ECG, echo, clinical examination, and then chest X-ray, and then based on screening echo, then we decide if they are more than 50-year-old or if they have more than two cardiovascular risk factors, so they get DSC. And then some patients who are more than 60 and who have diabetes history for more than 10 years, so we directly go for angiogram, cardiac angiogram, and then nowadays people are also doing CT angiograms and all those things. And patients who have problem on the right side of the heart, their PSP is more than 40, you have to be careful. And if people it is more than 50, then probably he needs a right heart catheterization. So this is true for any liver patient, but in patients who have NASH cirrhosis, we have to be like doubly sure what we are doing. So this is about the detailed cardiac workup. So patient comes to us, we have done evaluation, and then patient gets transplant done, and we have discharged him. And now how to take care of those patients in the follow-up. So I'm going to describe one by one the common complications these people will have. So majority of patients will have diabetes, and then some of them will develop diabetes after surgery. So like immediately after surgery, they may have, because of the critical illness, they may develop the stress-related diabetes, and then we use steroid and we use tacrolimus, and all these drugs are diabetogenic. So, so in patients who have NASH cirrhosis and diabetes, so we kind of modulate their immunosuppression. We try to taper their steroids early. We try to minimize CNI and try to use mTOR inhibitors. Then the like endocrinologists kind of go through all their medicines and make sure that they are on the right oral anti-diabetic drugs. And whenever you are using oral anti-diabetic drugs, then you have to look for the interactions with their immunosuppressive therapy. Then if nothing works, then you put them on insulin. But blood sugar management, peri-op period and long term is very important in these patients. Obesity. So before transplant, we have to consult patients for weight loss and physical activity, and then it has to continue after transplant also. We don't have good data on pharmacological treatment in post-LA setting, but there are some patients in which the sleeve gastrectomy or Roux-en-Y bypass has been done. Sleeve gastrectomy is preferred because we maintain the GI continuity, because in case in future you have to do any biliary interventions by ERCP. Another thing is by sleeve gastrectomy, you are going to maintain the enteric tract, and the immunosuppressant absorption will be more reliable compared to Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. There are upcoming role of endoscopic bariatric therapy, a lot of literature coming up. So I'm pretty sure anybody interested can go back and read it, like balloons and the endoscopic sleeve gastrectomy, all those things. So that is about obesity. A lot of our patients will have dyslipidemia. So the first line is lifestyle modification, low fat diet, but many of patients, majority don't respond. So we have to put them on statins. And when you put statins, you have to check for interaction. And if fibrates like statins are not tolerated, fibrates are used. So I generally use rosuvastatin, and many of the patients tolerate it well. And whenever you are using statin, so you have to look for myopathy. Some patients have myopathy secondary to statin. It can occur in non-transplant patients also. So when you are giving statins, look for muscle pain, fatigue, and all those things, and you may have to discontinue and then put them on fibrate. And then these omega-3 fish oils are supposed to be beneficial for hypertriglyceridemia. So dyslipidemia is more common in NASH cirrhosis, and especially patients are on mTOR inhibitors. So we have to keep a watch on it. Blood pressure, hypertension, yeah, again the lifestyle modification, low sodium diet, CNIs can cause hypertension, so reduce it. mTOR inhibitors are better. And then the first line for transplant patients who have high blood pressure is dihydropyrimidine calcium channel blockers, like we call amlodipine. That is the first choice. Then if the patient has proteinuria, then ACE inhibitors or angiotensin 2 receptor blockers can be considered. So when patient has underlying cardiac dysfunction, who have heart failure, then you use beta blockers in that. So that's about arterial hypertension. Needs to be very well managed. And then patients who have underlying cardiovascular disease, we advise them to get an echo, be on regular follow-up, and see cardiologist and get an echo at 6, 12, and 24 months after transplant. So we have lost couple of patients post-transplant because of sudden cardiovascular events. So you have to be very careful in these patients, especially whenever there is NASH cirrhosis. So patient may have renal dysfunction, so we have to use renal sparing agent. I had a webinar a couple of days back about the renal sparing strategies or nephron sparing strategies after liver transplant. So, and you have to control diabetes and hypertension well, because it in turn causes renal dysfunction. So, overall, how we manage NASH cirrhosis patients after transplant is we discontinue their steroids early. We give them low TAC, and we add antimetabolites or mTOR inhibitors for TAC minimization. But the mTOR inhibitors, as I said, whenever patient has arterial hypertension or dyslipidemia, mTOR inhibitors are not preferred, or you have to treat with some medicine, or you can consider antimetabolites. So that's briefly about NASH cirrhosis, pre-transplant evaluation, and the issues in the post-transplant period, and how we follow them on the long term. So that's it. Thanks all. Thanks everyone for the patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Thank you for covering the whole spectrum of NASH patients undergoing liver transplant. So in between, my connection had got bit cut. I'm not sure whether he touched on it. So what is your opinion on bariatric surgery in morbidly obese patients if once they develop DCLD? I mean, do you with transplant, after transplant?
Yeah, see, one patient I showed that we did in February. In fact, we planned to do a sleeve gastrectomy during surgery, but he was so obese. At the end of surgery, he was not very stable. So we said we'll do it later on. So I think child A cirrhosis, definitely you can do lap sleeve gastrectomy, but child B and child C, I think it's very difficult to manage them after bariatric surgery, because they will decompensate. So I would say endoscopic interventions are good. So we recently put a balloon in one of our patients, but obviously the risk of GI hemorrhage. So child B, child C, I think probably bariatric surgery is not a good option. And I went through some literatures where it says that if they undergo bariatric surgery, the survival is less compared to patients who does not undergo bariatric surgery.
Yeah. There are some questions in the chat box. Before I go back to the questions on elastography, there is one question on surgery which Sunil can take. How difficult is the transplant surgery after gastric Roux-en-Y loop anastomosis?
I see we have not come across this scenario so far, but I don't think so. It should be difficult. Obviously, we'll find some adhesions and all, but I don't think it will be difficult.
Yeah.
If there is like, for
I think,
example, patient gets a lot of SPP after after surgery, before transplant, there will be a lot of adhesions, but I don't anticipate much problem. But only thing is, as I said, post transplant, no biliary interventions because becomes difficult and they will have a problem with absorption of immunosuppressant. Surgery as such, I don't think it will be a problem.
Yeah, agree with that. So we have some questions in the chat box about what is the cutoff values for steatosis, for CAP, and also for cutoff values for fibrosis. So for fibrosis, I will tell you, so this is, first of all, we need to understand that it is a spectrum, and what has been studied in all the studies which they compare with the liver biopsy. So nothing is 100%. Like if the liver biopsy says it is F3 fibrosis, it is not that every patient we can very clearly delineate. But generally the agreement will be around 80 to 85%. So the cutoffs we usually accept would be less than 7. We can say that it is around F0, F1, and probably from 7 to 9 will be F2, and 9 to 11 will be F3, and anything more than 12 or 12.5 generally will be F4. So that is what I generally follow. And regarding the values for steatosis, so here it is actually the values are not well accepted, so even though the company people may give, but it is not very well established. So as I told you before, more than 275, it is significant for steatosis. That's what is accepted. But generally, what we follow is like S1. That means 0 to 10% of fat. That means around 240 to 260. 260 to 290 will be S2, that is 10 to 30%, and more than 290 will be 30%. So, but these values are not absolute. So the agreement is like OROC, the receiver operating curve for these values will be somewhere between 75%, 0.75. So that is what we follow. The next question I have here is, how FibroScan is different from FibroTouch. So should I be answering that? Okay, so anyway, the risky people are also there. So the difference between FibroScan and FibroTouch. So basically both are based on the same technology, that is elastography, transient elastography. So they use an impulse, ultrasound based impulse that passes through the liver, and then the velocity is measured, and that is expressed in kilopascals. Basically both are using the same technology. So the patented one in the West, most of the studies have been published on the FibroScan. The basic underlying technology is the same. Few differences between both would be, the impulse which you give, to generate that impulse. In the FibroScan machine, it will be in the hand, whereas here it will be foot. There will be a foot switch which operates the, which gives the pulse will be given at the intercostal space, but that foot operating switch will be in the leg. Few differences like that. And then this FibroTouch, that probe has got wider frequency. So whereas the FibroScan has got 2 different probes, one for medium and XL. So those are the basic differences. There are some studies to show that the FibroTouch and FibroScan have equivalent results, either in terms of liver stiffness or steatosis.
The other thing about FibroTouch is, because we are a developing country, I think FibroTouch is more economical,
yes,
for example, for all of us, because the FibroScan is pretty expensive compared to FibroTouch.
So we have more questions up on the chat box. somebody has asked, what is your experience with saroglitazole or SGLT2 inhibitors in the management of NASH patients? So, okay, that was not part of the topic, but still, I have used saroglitazole. Yes, definitely the transaminases come down. That is my experience. SGLT2 inhibitors, I have not used for NASH. But we will have to use the saroglitazole for a longer time to see, whether there is actually a reduction in the hard endpoint. So ultimately, you have to change the outcomes. The only thing which changes outcome will be the fibrosis. So how much fibrosis is going to change, that we'll have to wait and see.
So actually, as Dr. Himavalata said, no, we are in liver transplant and lot of donors come for us, and many of them may have fatty liver. As you said, the only thing which works in this patient is weight loss. So far, so that's very important, because I come and patients come and tell me that what to do for fatty liver, and they are ready to do everything except for exercise and weight loss. So I think that's the most important thing. That's what I tell my patients, like donors especially. They get worried because they come for screening and then they are told that you have fatty liver grade 2 and blah blah, all those things, and they're extremely worried, and they say, I do need to take any medicine, but I say that you need to lose weight and do exercise. So that's very important for NASH.
So this non-invasive test becomes very important for us when we for a donor evaluation, actually. So when it comes to fat, I think we use all three. Most centers may use CT and then MRI, and if they have elastography, they may use it, even though that is not reliable. And we take all three, especially in slightly overweight patients with a BMI of 27 or 28. We don't want them to have fat before the donor goes for surgery. So we use it. And when it is available, we use elastography to measure the liver stiffness also, if it is available. So, and then there's some more questions here.
Yeah, Dr. Ravindra Agarwal is asking some muscle pain post exercise. Yeah, if you are on, it is about if you are on statins for your hyperlipidemia, and then you can have muscle pain, which is basically means you have myopathy. It's a side effect of statin, and then case we have to stop. It's not about exercise. It's if you are started on statin for your cholesterol, and if you start having muscle pain, then you have to rule out myopathy. So it is this is how it is. So then I think Dr. Himamala, specific reference for cutoff value you suggest for fibrosis on transient elastography. I think you know better on that aspect.
Yeah. So the guidelines which I gave was the latest on EASL from European Society of Study of Liver Disease. So those are from the guidelines which was published last month. I have taken it. Okay.
And one more question: gastrosurgeon plays a role in management of NASH. Yeah, definitely. So gastrosurgeon. So obviously, if you, I don't know, it's a very broad thing. We as surgeons also see good number of NASH, and then you guide them what has to be. I have come across some patients who came for cholecystectomy, and then when you are doing cholecystectomy, you see liver is like fibrotic, and it may be NASH cirrhosis. So you guide them properly. Or if you are inside, then there's no much collaterals and all, then you can take a liver biopsy also at that time. So these are the things which comes in my mind, role of gastrosurgeon. But definitely, we have to identify these patients and help those patients. And I'm pretty sure, because whenever a patient comes to us, we get a CT scan or ultrasound, and many of the reports will have fatty liver. So we have to guide the patient that what has to be done. Then Mr. Yogendra Arya is asking, how do we evaluate and treat sarcopenia in pre-transplant setting? Very good question. So as I said, I published on this last year. So there are many how to sarcopenia. See, sarcopenia is a very broad entity. It can be divided into three components. One is muscle fiber loss, and second thing is accumulation of fat in the muscle, and then loss in function of the muscle. So sarcopenia has three components. So one is loss of muscle fiber. Secondary, the muscle fibers are getting replaced by fat, and then the third thing is functional loss. So, and then you have to assess for functional assessment. Then you have other tests like anthropometric measures, blah blah, all those things. They will make you do exercises, and you are made to lift the weight and all those. And structural aspect, we have ultrasound, we have CT scan, and we have MRI. So, like my study was based on like you can use like all the patients who come for transplant, they get a MRI or CT scan. So many of my patients had MRI, and based like on their MRI, I looked at their back muscles, and I found out how much muscle loss and how much fat. So that's about how we will identify sarcopenia. And then recent study has come, you can use ultrasound probe also and see how much is the muscle loss and how much is the fat replacement. So that's broadly about how will you evaluate and how will you treat. Obviously, two things. One is the nutrition. You make sure that the patient, though he having cirrhosis, he takes good nutrition, and then he continues exercise. Like they should not do heavy exercise, but they should do supervised exercise like brisk walk and all those things. So that's how once you know that you have cirrhosis, patient get depressed, they don't eat, they just they don't exercise, they don't walk, and then obviously their physical condition is not very supportive to do exercise. So you have to encourage them, supervise exercise and very good nutrition. So, and this is very important. Like this is very important if you want to have a good outcome after transplant. And as I said, my study shows that sarcopenia not only affects your overall survival, it also affects your graft survival. So if you have bad sarcopenia before transplant, your liver graft may not survive very long. So we have to understand this. So sarcopenia is very important and has to be addressed properly. Dr. Hemalata, if you want to add anything else, because I'm pretty sure you will be seeing patients after transplant. So you have anything to add on this?
No. Essentially, we follow these. So nowadays, like there is even though there is no like as compared to West, we don't have an established pre-transplant physio regime. But no standardized regime. But I am encouraging physiotherapists to be involved in all the pre-transplant patients. To have specific, apart from cardio, like the walking part, the strength building exercises. So we have to actively involve our patients in that, and that intervention has also been shown to reduce the mortality. So sarcopenia, not only the transplant outcome, but the incidence of sepsis as well as the encephalopathy. So everything improves once you improve the sarcopenia. So that is something we have to actively intervene.